Today we are at the American Bar Foundation in the office of Research Professor John Hagan, talking with him about his work on the ongoing crisis in the Darfur region of Sudan. In addition to his work with the American Bar Foundation, Professor Hagan is the co-director of the Center on Law and Globalization and the John D. MacArthur Professor of Sociology and Law at Northwestern University. His latest book, Darfur and the Crime of Genocide, was published in 2008 by Cambridge University Press. Professor Hagan, how did you become involved in conducting research on Darfur?
Several years before I began this research, I did work at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and particularly on the genocide that occurred in the village town of Srebrenica. When I was doing this research, one of the key investigators was a person by the name of Stephanie Fries, who collected crucial intercept evidence, communications between the generals who were involved in the attacks on Srebrenica. Later on, Stephanie Fries moved to the Coalition for International Justice in Washington, and she is actually the person who oversaw the survey work that was done in the Atrocities Documentation Survey across the border from Darfur in Chad. Now, this work was done to provide the evidence and foundation for Secretary Powell's determination that a genocide had occurred in Darfur. The point of doing this now in Chad was that the refugees were now across the border. In the camps inside Darfur, there was much greater difficulty in having them talk about the actual violence that they had experienced and their concerns about reprisals. So we wanted them to be able to talk freely about the killings, about the rapes, about how these deaths occurred during the attacks on the villages. There was an enormous amount of detail to these interviews, long accounts actually of the atrocities that had occurred in the villages from which they fled. Now, only a small part of this could be brought into the congressional testimony by Secretary of State Powell. So Stephanie Fries, who had overseen this research and understood full well the hundreds of thousands of dollars of costs that were involved in doing this, and the time and the energy, and the enormous emotional investment of the refugees themselves in the survey, she knew that we wanted this to have a broader audience. And social science research of the kind that we do represented an opportunity to bring out the full potential of these data and also bring them to bear on the kinds of legal questions that are involved in the topic of genocide.
There's been great controversy surrounding the estimation of the death toll in Darfur. There have been many different numbers cited. Why do the estimates of the death toll vary, and what are the political consequences of these different numbers?
There are lots of numbers, and of course the reason for this is that they're so important. The law of genocide has to do with the destruction of a group in whole or in part. So how many is whole or in part? There are also obvious sensitivities involved in these numbers. The Sudanese government is going to be enormously concerned about them because, of course, they're the government and their president is who is being charged. In the beginning, the challenge was just to get researchers into the country to be able to provide the humanitarian aid and also find out the scale of what was happening. So the researchers worked alongside the health workers, and they asked health-oriented kinds of questions about malnutrition and disease. Now, these are questions the Sudanese government was comfortable being asked because basically the Sudanese government would have liked to have blamed the death toll on the camps and the provision of humanitarian assistance. We're focused, of course, not only about the deaths that occur before the camps and on the way to the camps and in the camps, but we're also concerned about the violence, the killing that preceded going to the camps, and the rapes, and the kinds of crimes that are at the heart of the law of genocide. As a result, the Atrocities Documentation Survey was done across the border from Sudan in Chad. Secretary of State Colin Powell wanted to have evidence that he could use about the scale of this genocide that he could present to Congress. These are where the numbers come from. The earliest numbers were on the order of 70,000 deaths in 7 months. Soon that became 180,000 deaths in 18 months. But still, we weren't including the violence, the actual killing that was involved in leading people to flee to the camps. The Atrocities Documentation Survey, because it was done across the border in Chad, could ask these sensitive questions about the killing, about the rapes, about the violence. And this is where the numbers began to grow. Our earliest estimate was that as many as 350,000 people had died and that another 50,000 had gone missing. These were large numbers. As the events evolved over time, the State Department began to kind of shift its focus. When Condoleezza Rice became Secretary of State, she began to become concerned about the political negotiations that were going on with Sudan. And actually, the State Department became involved in generating an alternative estimate of the number of deaths that had occurred. The estimate that was offered by her Deputy Secretary of State, Robert Zoellick, on a trip to Khartoum in Sudan in 2005, in April of 2005, an estimate was provided that as low as 60,000 people might have died, as many as 160,000. These were much lower numbers, and the media began to focus on this and began to report that tens of thousands had died. We wanted to be more accurate about that death toll, and we wanted to address the legal dimensions of this problem more accurately. We generated a new estimate where we tried to establish what's the least number that might have died in Darfur. The number that we came up with and the new estimate for Science, published in Science, was that 200,000 had died. We were careful in that article to say that at a minimum 200,000 had died, but perhaps again as many as 350,000 might have died. So we established a range. The news media again began to report that hundreds of thousands had died rather than tens of thousands. And today we generally hear numbers in the order of 300,000, which I think is an appropriate scaling of the dimension of this genocide and why, of course, this is a legally important set of events for the people who have died in Darfur.